And I'm going to go quickly through these just in the interest of time, but as we look sector by sector, there was some discussion yesterday about the price of PV, and I do think that photovoltaics is really a very exciting area going forward. And this is this black line that you see here represents the cost per watt of a solar module, and what the price should have been based on the improvements in technologies that we were seeing year on year. And as you can see, from 2003 to 2004, we sort of trundled down that learning curve very nicely. But then suddenly, when demand went up and there was a lack of supply of silicon, we saw a real hang-up, and the price artificially stayed high for a few years. And now we're in a period where you look towards the right here and you see a few dotted lines where the price is dropping very quickly. In fact, it might even be dropping, in some cases, below the cost of production for some manufacturers. And again, to me, this represents opportunity for governments who may now be ready to make a strategic investment, because there's a bargain to be had now compared to where we were 3 years ago. Somewhat similarly with wind turbines, I won't explain this whole chart except to say that the length of the contracts that are being signed are shorter. I mean, the delivery times are shorter. The demands that manufacturers are placing on project developers are much lower. We are in suddenly, very quickly, a wind turbine glut worldwide, which is good news again for developers. Again, when we look at ethanol as an example of biofuel overcapacity in the United States, we have about 12.5 billion gallons of ethanol capacity that's built, but only about 10.5 that's actually operating. And not too coincidentally, that's more or less the requirement under federal law for the amount that gets blended into the U.S. fuel supply. So it's going to be a continuing issue here where we have oversupply on biofuels. One thing that doesn't get talked about as much is we hear a lot of very happy talk about job creation and clean energy, but the reality in the last 6 months is that there have been a fair number of jobs lost in this sector. And it's not been immune to the global downturn. And just a quick point I'd make, these are some recent headlines. Manufacturing capacity, I'm going to skip through these and get very quickly. One last point, which I just wanted to make, there was some discussion yesterday about the cost of renewables versus coal. And in some sense, it's completely apples to oranges, because on the one hand, with a coal plant, the investment in the actual plant is not that expensive compared to your long-run costs, the marginal costs of buying coal on an ongoing basis. With the case of a renewable plant, all the money comes up front. And therefore, the cost of your financing is critically important. So to some degree, it is really apples and oranges. So with that caveat, and also with the caveat that those up in the cheap seats probably can't read this at all, I would point out that, that coal is still cheaper for the most part than solar on an installed basis when you do not take into account potential subsidies. It's just a reality. I mean, we've seen progress, and frankly, we're all for subsidies that help close the gap. But the reality is, coal's cheaper if you don't tax it or cap and trade it or do something to it. It's just where we are right now than solar is. But there are some cases certainly where we're seeing onshore wind that is competing. And then I'm just going to, one last thing here. We've tracked about, at this point, in the neighborhood of about $165 billion in stimulus that is committed towards clean energy worldwide, with the United States leading the pack. This is very exciting for the industry and very well timed and very important. And the key will be, obviously, implementation. The commitments are there. Whether or not the governments can actually disperse the money in an effective way, we shall see. In some sense, I think some within our industry had expected that the moment that Obama signed the stimulus plan into law, the money would start pouring out of the federal government. I think those of us who track government realized that it was going to take a little bit longer, but they do seem to be quite competent in getting the money out the door. And then I'm going to make one very last point just before we finish, and I think one or two of the speakers alluded to the question of, how much is enough? $155 billion in 2008. This year will probably be more like $100 billion worldwide. Is that enough, though, to stem, the potential harmful effects of of climate change? And the answer very clearly is no. I mean, the number needs to get to about 500 billion. I think McKinsey has a number that's a little bit different than ours, but that's our number in conjunction with the UN EP, and I think that, you know, I would just say that we've got a lot of work to be done, but clearly progress has been made. Thank you.